This is Media Magic, Making Class Invisible from Race, Class, and Gender, 10th edition. So, in the media, when it comes to mass media and influence, media is one of the most influential sources that shapes public consciousness in our culture. Media ownership is extremely concentrated, with 90+% of the media owned by a handful of corporations, which means that everything we read, hear, see is controlled by a handful of powerful corporations. The media is also profit-oriented, so there's an issue of political economy of the media, which means that the media relies on advertising. So think about your Netflix or Hulu membership, right? I pay more not to watch commercials personally. Cable used to be like that, if you can believe it. Cable used to have no commercials because you pay for the content. But it takes a lot of money to make the stuff we watch, so they would have to charge you a lot of money to make all that content. So instead, we have advertisements. So the media is not selling us their stuff as much as it's selling us to consumers, our viewership, our eyeballs, sold to companies so they can market things to us to increase their profits. In many ways, the media reflects power, establishes power, and media in the news realm is extremely skewed in approach and focus as a result of all the things they can't report on because it would go against their advertisers. And all the things they cannot give you a real context on because then you'd be harder to propagandize. Media is also key to establishing roles in the culture, defining our tastes, helping us locate ourselves in history, establishing our national identity, which of course shapes our societal possibilities. So the U.S. is stratified. We're the most highly stratified society in the industrialized world, as social class distinctions control our lives. It affects where we live, where we work, and the quality of our schooling and our health or life expectancy. So when it comes to the poor, there's little coverage of poor people in poverty, and when it does happen, it's often distorted and stereotyped. So some of these arguments in the reading, we're going to go through them real quick. So the first was that the poor don't exist. And this is reflected in how news media ignores the poor and the issues that affect their lives. So this means those who are not poor are unaware of the problems the poor face. And what they see instead are narratives that blame the poor and promote false notions of meritocracy, which shapes cultural understandings of and portrayals of the poor. Another argument is that the poor are faceless. Coverage on poverty is usually looking at statistics instead of talking to those who are poor and are facing issues of poverty. So this turns the poor into faceless numbers. And as a result, we can often not empathize with statistics, but if you look in the face of a hungry child or a frightened parent or an overworked person living in their car, we can see a part of ourselves in their experiences and stories that often gets lost in the focus on numbers in the media. Another one from the reading is that the poor are undeserving. So media fulfills this narrative by portraying the rich, right? Focusing on their issues. But when you hear stories of poor drug addicts, you hear about them as petty criminals. But when the rich are drug addicts, they're redeemable. They get to go to Malibu and be interviewed by Dr. Drew. Another one is that the poor are an eyesore. So instead of focusing on the plight of the poor, they focus on the middle-class opposition to the poor. So this narrative tells us that the poor are an inconvenience and an irritation. Stories often look at groups of poor people, especially the homeless, as a blight on otherwise lovely communities. And there's a lot of support for forcefully relocating the homeless populations to neighboring cities, which does nothing to address the issues or reduce the amount of people living on the street. Another one discussed in the reading is that the poor have only themselves to blame. This is the basic culture of poverty argument, that the poor are at fault for their low social position. We're told that the poor are trapped in a hopeless cycle of poverty, using street culture and stereotypes about the poor that are used to justify their unequal position. It's the attitude of the poor that makes them poor. It's the promiscuity of the poor that makes them poor. It's the absent fathers and the teen mothers that makes them poor. It's the poor's unquenchable greed and love of a scheme or quick money that makes them poor, which of course makes no sense. There are variations of these stereotypes that differ slightly based on race and ethnicity, on gender and sexuality, among others, like age and disability. In reality, the majority of the poor are white Americans. The issues that the poor face often have to do with structural issues of pay inequality, education inequality, and all the systems that have been skewed to the influence of money to not favor the poor, such as the criminal justice system, or in politics and elected leadership. Another one is that the poor are down on their luck. During the holidays, local news programs will often briefly mention the poor in line at the soup kitchen, focusing on their analysis of the middle class or affluent people whose money or volunteer time make those soup kitchens possible. There's a sense from these narratives that the poor are just facing a temporary setback. They're just down on their luck, and that will improve with time and a change in luck. Again, this is just a way that we ignore the entrenched issues with poverty, how it can affect multiple generations, and how lack of resources exist to help people out of these situations. All of these messages combine to inform our perspectives on poverty. By suggesting that the poor have brought poverty upon themselves, the media is engaging in what William Ryan calls blaming the victim. To do this, you first identify what's different about the poor, then you define those differences as the causes of poverty itself. The cumulative message becomes that if the poor are flawed people, obviously the real problem is how systemic class issues cause these inequalities, how class inequality is the direct result of economic and political policies that deprive people of jobs, adequate wages, or legitimate support. Poverty affects us all our wages, but the media spin keeps false narratives alive. So we could solve the issues of poverty if we chose to. For example, a quick solution to homelessness is to give people homes. So about everyone else, media skews the viewpoint through focusing on the world and the people in it through an affluent gaze. So there's all these arguments they talk about in the reading, like that the wealthy are us. And so this is reflected in how much media time focuses on the lives of the wealthy. And the message we receive from this coverage is that the concerns of the wealthy should be our concerns too. Another one is that the wealthy as a social class don't exist. So this is where media fails to notice the ways in which the rich as a social class of people create and shape domestic and foreign policy. So corporate lobbying is ignored or taken for granted or assumed to be in the public interest, which is connected to the next one, that the wealthy are fascinating and benevolent, right? Elon Musk would be a great example of this, right? People really praised him and loved him, and then he tried to name his kid some weird stuff. And it's this idea that they are visionaries, they're geniuses. If they're a billionaire, it's not because they paid their workers terribly or, stepped on people's throats to get up there. It's because they're geniuses and they're benevolent, right? They're like Iron Man. They're really working for you, right? That, they have your best interest at heart, which of course goes against every reasonable fact related to them, right? Another one is that the wealthy include a few bad apples. So when you have your Bernie Madoffs or, your tax dodging Donald Trumps, the idea is, well, this doesn't actually represent the overall wealthy as a class, not in the same way that one poor person that does something bad is supposedly a representation of all poor people. But the wealthy, it's supposed to just be, no, as a class, they're good. It's just a couple bad apples. Another one is that the middle class is us. This is an interesting one, as we often see the middle class portrayed and reflected in most media and even in political coverage, which is, I think, why most people think that they're middle class, even if they're rich or poor. That's why you don't ask on a survey, what class are you? You ask someone how much money they make or what their occupation is, because most people think they're middle class as a reflection of how these portrayals kind of worm their way into our brains. Another one from the reading is that the middle class is a victim, right? That the middle class is a target. The middle class is shrinking, that we need to focus on the issues that affect middle class families, right? All of these things, while the working class, the poor, are actually the victims of society, are actually living in the conditions that people are afraid the middle class are slipping into, right? But we don't focus on them. We demonize them and we blame them. We say it's their fault. But the middle class, on the other hand, as they lose wage security, as the issues that are affecting the poor start to kind of trickle up, then, that's more of a moral characterization. So this affects the way that people internalize the social class values, right? By valuing middle class and upper class individuals. Another kind of trope discussed is the middle class is not a working class. This idea that middle class people are just regular families struggling through life, that they're kind of almost a hegemonic norm, right? That while they work, that's not really the central focus of their identity in the same way that the working class, it literally is. Or for people that are underemployed or unemployed, that working is completely connected to their identities. So even when you have more positive portrayals of working class individuals, so sometimes the poor are represented as heroes, right? Like the Hunger Games. And the rich are represented as the bad guys. But overwhelmingly in the media, the reinforcement of wealth as good is overwhelming. So like I said before, the media shapes how we think about each other in society. So if we celebrate the lifestyles of the upper and middle classes, and media creates the impression that the interests and worries of the well-off are the ones that we should be concerned about, then class differences and conflicts are concealed and rendered irrelevant.